Mike Tomlin spoke before owners' meetings this weekend. I want to talk about what he said and why it signals something we've been talking about a lot on this show, and it's how the Steelers are trying to get ahead of the trends. That, plus their free agency moves of adding Zach Gentry and Raven Clark, and Mock Draft Monday, all here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app as well as YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes as well as your bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first lesson every day because we're your team every day. Now, the Steelers did make a couple moves in free agency. We will address those moves in the second segment. I want to talk about something that Mike Tomlin did say at owners' meetings. Now, owners' meetings are in Arizona. There's some people on the ground. I'm not. I've just done a whole bunch of traveling. I just got back from March Madness. I'm happy to be in my own house for a bit. But reading on some of the reporting, and you can read this report from Nick Farabaugh of SteelersNow.com when he wrote this story and did a good job of doing so, talking about how Mike Tomlin guarantees the Steelers' identity will be smash mouth football. Now, I'm not going to pat myself in the back here, but this is what we've been talking about on this show for a while. Not even just this past year, but last year as well. Josh Taylor has also been talking about this, our guest from 93.7 The Fan and KDKA TV. The Steelers are going to be trying to be a more run-dominant team. Doesn't mean they'll run all the time, but it is the way that they want to go because that is part of the path of the NFL. The exact quote that Mike Tomlin was recorded for saying was, quote, "I think a sound running game aids quarterbacks, particularly young quarterbacks. I don't think we're bashful about our intentions there." And then he also said, "I think rushing was probably at a 25-year high in terms of yards and yards per rush. Quarterback mobility has a component. I'm sure there's a myriad of reasons that kind of outline that, but the one stat that sticks out to you is the uptick in rushing. And so passing is down, rushing is up. It's a reasonable discussion." Now, to back this up, if you go and you start looking at the numbers, you can see support for the numbers that rushing, the teams that are rushing, their teams are running the ball more often. It's not a huge jump, but it's a steady climb, a slow and steady climb that's been happening over the past few years. If you just go back to 2020, the top team that was running the ball ran the ball 55% of the time. That was the Ravens. But now there's teams running 56% of the time, and more teams running 55% of the time. And now that steady climb has gone up. There's also a report from the New York Times that wrote about this back during the season, even saying that, as over the past few years, you've seen that slow, steady climb of more and more teams rushing the football. As a whole, the league ran the ball 41.9% of the time in 2020. Now that's up to 42.7%. Again, according to the New York Times in a story that they did there called NFL Teams Have Rediscovered Their Running Backs This Season. Part of it is quarterback mobility as well, like Daniel Jones and the Giants. That's a big part of it because he loves to run the football. Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, all of them very good runners of the football as well. But it's what we've been talking about here on this show. Not every team can just draft Patrick Mahomes and try to win that way. Other teams have to find different ways to win. I've been talking about it a lot, and I will continue to talk about it because I've been saying this is the direction that Steelers football is headed. And I don't think it's a bad thing because there's some people that are trying to say, oh, it's a passing league and you can't win without it being a passing league. And while I do agree that it is still a passing league, there are teams, like I said at the start of last week, I think the start of the week before that, a lot of teams have tooled their defenses to stop the other high passing offenses in the NFL. And when tooling your defense to stop that, you are putting in smaller, quicker, faster linebackers and defensive backs who aren't as adept at stuffing the run and being bigger and more physical. And that's where, if you're a big physical run team, this is where it comes the most in handy. And again, Mike Tomlin saying this, I don't think this is his tipping his hand. The Steelers have been building towards this now. That's why they drafted Najee Harris with a first round pick. That's why they've been investing into rebuilding the interior offensive line this offseason. That's why I still think an offensive tackle is absolutely going to be in play either first or second round for the Steelers, and almost maybe even mandatory because they want to build an offensive line in the future that has a pillar player that they can kind of build around there. So I say all that to say, I think that the Steelers are in a position right now where if they continue on this path, they can build the team that's successful, and they can kind of even get in front of that charge. There are teams that have already started to try to play this way, like the Eagles and the 49ers, who both made the NFC Championship. But if you go back and look at the Super Bowl winners, no one's truly cashed in on this yet. Yeah, the Chiefs beating the Eagles, though. The Chiefs are a team that's learned how to run the ball when they need to. And if you go back to their first Super Bowl win, that was a big part of it. But you go back to the Rams, not necessarily a run team. The Buccaneers ran better. They didn't have a committed run game, but they ran better, and they invested in their offensive line. We talked about the Chiefs the first time, the Patriots over the Rams, the Eagles over the Patriots. None of those teams were run dominant teams that grounded you away. But I think that the point is that the days of those types of teams that will have their chance to be more successful are a lot closer than you think. And it's still not going to say that the teams that are throwing the ball aren't going to be good. They're going to be good. They're going to be talented. They're going to have their levels of success in the NFL. And it's not to say that Kenny Pickett can't ascend to a place where he'll be a proficient passer and even elite passer someday at the quarterback position. But while he's developing, the Steelers are going to be trying to make themselves a strong run-based team that plays really tough defense, stuffs the run, get after the quarterback, and on the other side also runs the ball really well and then allows things to open up for Kenny Pickett. As Mike Tomlin said, it just makes things easier. And it makes a lot of sense. Again, I don't think this is some wizardry here. This is just the Steelers looking at the analytics and saying, okay, the NFL starting to trend back this way. Let's get ahead of it and let's become one of the better teams at it. Now, we've seen them add in players. Isaac Seumalo added in left guard. They got Nate Herbig. There's going to be some additions there. They still haven't made any moves on offensive tackle, and that's again why I think that is going to be a strong move at some point in this NFL draft class. I don't think that they're going to be, there's many others out there right now that they'd get in free agency or via trade. I think this is their chance to go get their young, stalwart offensive tackle who becomes the leader of the group in the coming years. But right now, he'll be the young guy on a line full of veterans that they've signed in free agency or have developed on their own. And that's where I think the Steelers can, again, get ahead of some of these other teams there. Again, even with the Steelers as they were a game away from the playoffs this year. You know, that they made the playoffs the year before. They're trying to get to a point where this is who they can be. It just takes time to get there. But I think that by the investment that they've showed in their line, making sure their running back room strong with Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, and if they can get a really good pick at offensive tackle in this draft class, I think it puts them in prime position to say, hey, you know what? Next year in the NFL, we're going to be the team that grinds you out. We're going to be the team that's pushing you around down the field and force you to consider, should you maybe put some more linebackers on the field instead of a box safeties and slot cornerbacks. I think that's going to be a big part of what the Steelers try to do moving forward, and I think it's going to be a big part of, if it's successful, I think it'll be another time when the Steelers bucked a trend or got in ahead of a trend, I should say. And if you go back to the early 2000s, the Steelers were the last team using a 3-4 defense at one point. The Ravens then copied them, and then when people saw the Ravens and the Steelers' success with the 3-4, a lot of teams started to switch back into the 3-4. Things go in cycles, and of course, that trend kind of went, pushed back on itself a little bit there. And the Steelers don't even go in 3-4 all the time anymore. But point being, these are the things that I think great teams try to do, or great organizations try to do, is that, like, recognizing, okay, not only is you need to recognize not only your strengths, but also the strengths and weaknesses of the opponents that you're going to have to beat around the league if you want to be a successful team. So all that being said, I think the Steelers and Mike Tomlin got the right idea. They've been investing in it. I still think they need to invest more. They need an offensive tackle, at least one who I think is mean, nasty, sets the tone, especially in the run game, and isn't a liability in pass protection. Lots to say and do there. But let's talk about some of these free agent moves that they did and how it might set up the opportunity to go get one of those guys in the NFL draft. We'll do that in just a minute. But first, love to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel. FanDuel, of course, is America's #1 sports book. If you don't know about it, get on it right now, because new customers get what's called the no sweat first bet that gives you up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet on FanDuel Sportsbook doesn't win you money. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet everything from the money line to point scores to how many three-pointers get drained. And FanDuel lets you make player prop bets to give you so many options. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss out on the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing our discussion here on the Pittsburgh Steelers. And again, on the run subject, I just think the writing is on the wall. So just the Steelers the Steelers are saying this, get behind it. And I think that more moves, they kind of solidified things, were just kind of things that they've been doing over the weekend. Now, Omar Khan in the front office, they did not take much time off this on Saturday, my birthday, by the way. Thanks to all those who reached out and said happy birthday. But they went and they brought back Zach Gentry. And of course, Zach Gentry, the second tight end this past year, more of the run blocking tight end than Pat Freiermuth is. But this now puts the Steelers in a position where they don't necessarily have to draft a tight end. And in fact, they technically have three on the roster with Pat Freiermuth, Gentry, and Connor Hayward. But I will say this, Connor Hayward isn't your traditional build of a tight end. He's more of an H-back that can flex to the third tight end option. And I wouldn't preclude the Steelers entirely from being able to draft a tight end. Now, just knowing how they think, I think that they look at a lot of different needs, and they want to address those needs any way that they can. And especially in the early picks, where I think they can get, or the Steelers could get, a really good tight end who would make for a serious 1-2 punch with Pat Freiermuth. I think that part's out of the equation in the way they balance this by adding Zach Gentry. But I still think it would be a smart move if they pulled it off. I just don't know if they will, because I think that they're going to be looking at corners and defensive linemen and offensive linemen and linebacker. There's going to have all these other positions the Steelers have to worry about other than tight end. So maybe this is just putting themselves in a position where if they miss out on the opportunity, it's not like they're crushed at tight end. But again, the idea of getting a really talented tight end from a really talented tight end class sounds very enticing at the moment. The Steelers also went and added Raven Clark. He is a former Eagle / Titan. He's bounced around the NFL for a bit, but he's a swing tackle option, and that's because they lost Trent Scott in free agency. But this is a guy who comes in with a lot of experience. He's played both left and right tackle. When you look at his how he's played over the years, and what he's been able to bring to the table. But he was more for Philly this past year. And again, it's the third former Eagle offensive lineman that has now been added to the roster since Andy Weidl took over. But if you look at LaRaven Clark, what he's done, he's played both left and right tackle. This past year, he filled in a little bit, started to fill in more towards the end of the regular season. And didn't do terrible. Nothing going to light it up. But again, he's more of the swing tackle guy. He's a former third round pick. He's on your roster now. You bring him in, and you kind of just want to let him settle things down, be the kind of guy that floats between right, left tackle, or being the sixth offensive lineman on the field when the Steelers want to get in heavy packages and start pounding people even more. So again, these signings, they just continue to kind of make sure that there's a solid foundation without too many glaring holes in the roster. That way, that when draft day comes and Andy Weidl has his board and Omar Khan and Mike Tomlin are going over things and they're valuing their options, one thing that won't value into their options is having to worry about gaping holes on the roster. And that's where, and you may say, like, you know what, the Steelers still need a top tier offensive lineman. They still need another receiver. Yeah, sure, there's needs, but these aren't, like, if these things aren't, these aren't situations where if these things aren't addressed, the worst could be assumed about the Steelers roster. Like, they wouldn't be able to play football with the situation, because there's been times where certain teams, they've had to let guys go. They haven't had money to sign people back, and it just leaves them very exposed. And that's one thing the Steelers try not to do. They want to make sure that there's going into each season, they have answers at each position. It doesn't always work. They acknowledge that too. They've talked about how, like, sometimes you just got to roll with the punches you give it, and sometimes those punches add up really fast on you from other teams. But again, I get back to my point here. this is very much kind of the feeling of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because yes, Omar Khan is making different moves. We talked about Terrell Edmonds not being back. We talked about the moves that they've been getting, some of the younger linebackers that they've added. There's been there's been differences, but they've been with the same goal in mind as far as trying to make sure that the roster is solidified before the NFL draft, so that all you're adding are the rookies, and that'll be the biggest thing that you have to worry about at that point. So again, I think that's very much the Kevin Colbert philosophy. They're just going about it their own way as far as how to fill those spots. And I think that's what's very interesting about this. And again, this doesn't eliminate them from taking tight end, but man, the more and more I just see how they're setting things up, it just makes the most sense for them to go get an offensive tackle with an early pick, find a way to get him, find a way to make him a stable part of your offense, and then let the chips roll from there. And if you hit, you hit. If you don't, it happens. Everybody misses in the NFL draft at some point. And it's just a thing. But I think they're gearing up for that to be the focus here, especially when you look at how they've kind of filled in a lot of different roster spots and how Mike Tomlin was talking about when we were reading what he was saying at NFL owners meetings in Arizona over this past weekend. But that's all very interesting. That's all very fascinating. And I think it goes back to what we've been saying about the Steelers' plan right now to kind of even things out. But there's a lot to be said about what direction they go in. We played Mock Draft Monday. We have a new winner this week. There was a new rule thrown in. A lot more of you followed this week's rule than others. But we'll get to who won that and how it fits into that plan, because I made a rule about your first pick having to be a defensive player. We'll see how that played out for the people who participated, and we'll get to show you our winner here on Mock Draft Monday right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing our Locked On Steelers show, and it's Mock Draft Monday time, where we go over all the mock drafts that you guys sent in. Again, you guys keep sending in over 100, and I appreciate that because it gives me a lot to go through. But we have a winner this week. Again, the rule was you had to pick a defensive player with your first pick. You could trade up or trade down or whatever you want to do, stay put if you wanted. But the bottom line was you had to make sure that first player was a defensive player and then go from there and assemble the best group. And this guy did a really good job of putting that together and addressing a lot of the needs. And clearly listen to the show because some of these were really interesting recommendations. Or not really just recommendations. These are things that we've talked about in the show. First of all, Seth Rush is our winner. Thank you for your submissions, and congratulations to Seth Rush for winning Mock Draft Monday. Seth made some interesting moves here. One, he traded back, which is what I've said is a very interesting. I think would be a good move for the Steelers in the long run here, because I think that there's a lot of really good day 2 prospects that if you can add just at least one more day 2 pick, you give yourself an even better chance to really hit on this draft class. And lo and behold, they got that extra day 2 pick. Now, I will say this. The Buccaneers giving up the 17th overall pick to just get the 19th overall pick, they gave up the they gave up the 19th overall pick for the Steelers, giving them the 17th overall pick. So there you go. So they're only going down 2 spots, and the Buccaneers also gave up their 3rd round pick at 82 overall. The draft tech chart would say that that's a little rich in favoring the Steelers there, but I'll allow it for now. Point being, Seth went in and he started to address needs immediately. First round, he goes and gets Lucas Van Ness, though Van Ness is listed like an edge. He can play defensive line, and I think that his attributes, his athleticism, it all adds up with what the Steelers want. It just makes a lot of sense to get him while moving back and picking up an extra 3rd round pick. That's a pretty good start. Then with the 2nd round pick at 32nd overall, Seth stayed put and got Deonte Banks. Now, Deonte Banks is a guy who's risen. He's skyrocketed in his draft stock in the past few weeks because of his athleticism. You see him fly. He can run real well. He plays real well. But I think a lot of people were saying he's not in the Christian Gonzalez, Devin Witherspoon camp. He's not among those corners that should go top 15, on average, but He's a freakish athlete. When you look at all the measurables he has, he's really solid there. And that's why I think at 32, that's a very good value for bringing him in. Then at 49th overall, Seth went and got his offensive tackle, Matthew Bergeron. I've talked about Bergeron before on this show. I think he's really solid. Needs to get a little bit nastier at times, but I think that he's a good place guy right now to kind of hold things up from Syracuse, bring him in, see how he does with the Steelers offensive line. If he starts, great. If not, you have a second round guy who's sitting and waiting for whenever someone does mess up. Then with the Steelers' natural third round pick, Seth went and got Travius Hodges Tomlinson. I've talked about him before. He's a really good slot corner with really good ball skills. I think that he's someone that you definitely want to keep your eyes on as far as some of the Steelers could actually consider at some point in the NFL draft. Then with the extra pick that Seth traded for, he got the 82nd pick, and he drafted linebacker Dorian Williams of Tulane. Now, you may not know that name because we haven't talked about him a whole bunch here, but if you look at him, that guy flies around the field. He's quick, he's fast, he finds a way to to be good in coverage, and I think that that's where Dorian Williams could be a really good asset for the Steelers, because if they're not getting any of the top tier linebackers, they need someone who specializes in something. And Dorian Williams specializes in coverage, considering the two guys that they got, they're kind of run stopping guys. Makes a lot of sense for Dorian Williams to get his chance to show what he can do for the Pittsburgh Steelers and see if he can be the cover linebacker option that they bring on the field whenever they feel like there's a tough matchup coming up. But then after that, Seth went and got a wide receiver, Jaden Reed out of Michigan State. Jaden Reed, if you remember my talking about what happened at the Senior Bowl, Jaden Reed was cutting it up. He was he showed really good routes, looked really good in the slot. I think that he could be a guy that the Steelers could use, because also the Steelers lost Steven Sims to free agency. With Steven Sims gone, I thought he was definitely going to be around. But with him gone, Jaden Reed is going to be, kind of a more primary option as far as being a slot guy and being the third receiver off the bench, the first receiver off the bench if he can earn that spot. Because of course Pickens and Johnson are both going to be your top guys there. But again, a good slot option, and at worst, he's competition for Calvin Austin, and you guys keep on trucking. But then your 7th round picks, Mohamed Diabate from Utah. And then the one that I think a lot of Steelers fans are doing is safety Brandon Hill out of Pitt. I've covered Brandon Hill, really good dude. His pro day will be on the 29th, but he ran the fastest time of all safeties. This past NFL Combine. So I think he'd be a good ad for the Steelers if they can get him super late, just because I think that Brandon Hill, we talked about how Terrell Edmonds' departure is going to leave some things here for the Steelers, and they still have to address that. But Brandon Hill is a kind of a guy that, with his explosiveness and his speed, he could be an asset to a defense, even if he's just on special teams at first. But I think Brandon Hill could be an interesting fit there. So there you have it. Seth Rush's winning mock draft Monday picks here are Lucas Van Ness, Deontay Banks, Matthew Bergeron, Travius Hodges Tomlinson, Dorian Williams, Jaden Reed, Mohamed Diabate, and Brandon Hill, all with a simple trade that was made to move back 2 spots and pick up an extra 3rd spot. And who knows, maybe that's good currency in some people's eyes. But all things being considered here, I really think that the Steelers continue to set things up. Also, something we will talk about later this week, because it's still a long week ahead of us. The Steelers brought back in Bud Dupree for a physical or a workout, I guess, and just to see what his evaluation was and to see what his status was. And we haven't heard anything yet, but this was something we told you was potentially coming on this show for like the past month and a half, that the Steelers are probably going to try to the Steelers are probably going to be trying to bring back Bud Dupree to bolster the edge rushing position. And this won't be like Melvin Ingram. This won't be, Bud Dupree comes in and is like, well, why am I not starting? He knows the deal. Alex Highsmith's a double-digit sack man from last year. Bud wouldn't be coming in. If Bud was brought in, Bud would come in with the sensibilities to know what the deal is and why things are the way that they are. So I don't think you have to worry about that. If it happens, great. If not, I think people will also survive. The Steelers will find another edge in the NFL draft. But I do think that as far as edge options go, having a reliable guy who could rotate in and Bud Dupree, and if you're concerned about his injuries, he wouldn't play as much, so that would maybe limit his injury chances. I think all of these things add up positively for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But we'll keep you up to date with all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast as owners' meetings continue, free agency continues, and we get ever so closer to the NFL draft. We got guests lined up all week long. We'll have more guests coming on this show very soon. Thanks again for checking out the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Find this show on your favorite podcasting app or especially on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes as well as your bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day because we're your team every day. Again, I'm Chris Carter. We're back Tuesday with more talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.